I'd like to welcome everyone here for the second session of our topic, Wheel of Sharp Weapons. And I'm going to invite Stephen again to lead the prayers. So thank you, Stephen.
Sorry, I always have trouble with this. Sorry.
Oh yeah, take your time, John.
There we go. Is that coming through for you guys or not?
The prayers aren't, no.
No, okay.
That's it.
All good? Is that working, Stephen?
It is. Thank you very much, John. Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha, to the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all three ever devout homage, to all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms atoms in all aspects, with supreme faith, I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions. Perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Through these merits, may sentient beings attain the rank of all-seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from Samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. The Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. I prostrate to the Arya Triple Gem. Thus did I hear at one time the Bhagawan was dwelling on massive Vulture's Mountain, in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokiteshvara. How should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness. No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly, completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Tayata Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Soha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagawan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagawan having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvatiputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed, highly praised that spoken by the Bhagawan. A short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kamiryataya. Okay, once in Tibetan and twice in English. Sangye Chodong Soki Chognam La. Kanchu Bardu Dani Gimsu.
Dagejin Soge Peso Namki Krola Panche
Sangye Arshok. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Thank you very much. So for our initial motivation today, I'm going to quote from Lama Chopa. Please bless me to realize that the chronic disease of self-cherishing, the thought cherishing the I, is the cause of all our undesired sufferings, and to destroy this great demon of self-cherishing by blaming and harboring a grudge against it. Lama Zopa Rinpoche requests that we recite this verse every day and the next verse. Please bless me to see that cherishing all mother sentient beings and wanting to lead them to bliss is the door to infinite good qualities, and to cherish them more than our lives, even should they rise up as our enemies. So Kabje Zopa Rinpoche says it's very, very good to recite these verses in daily life in general, And when you're feeling depressed in particular, use your depression to practice the meaning of these two verses. So you can see here that Rinpoche is actually pointing, be a better word, to the very practices that we're studying together in this particular text. So as the Guru Puja says very vividly, cherishing the I is the door to all suffering and problems. Since all the problems and obstacles to happiness we encounter come from cherishing our I, we should renounce our I forever, says Lama Zopa Rinpoche. In other words, give it up completely, he says. And since all happiness comes from bodhicitta, cherishing others, every good thing, every happiness, including enlightenment, comes from others. Therefore, sentient beings are all that you should ever cherish. Furthermore, since every happiness and perfection, including all realizations up to enlightenment, come from other sentient beings, you have to repay their kindness. You have to help them. So with that as our motivation, we're going to recite now the Tonlen verse from the Guru Puja with the chant. And as I mentioned last week, Lama Zopa Rinpoche recommends we do the chant. And I'm going to ask John to throw this up onto the screen. So it's the Tonlen verse from Guru Puja. So if you scroll down a little bit, John, so we can get the Tibetan. So you'll recognize this chant from the Lama Chopa. We recite it 3 times while doing Tonlen meditation, but because of the way the stanzas fall, in order to complete the chant, we repeat the last line twice at the end of the 3rd repetition. So feel free to join with me. Dene Jesun Lama Tuje Chen Magudrowe Digdridu Naukun Maludata Dadla Minpa Tang Dagi Deje Shen La Tang Wai Trokunde Dang Dempa Jingi Lo Dena Jesun Lama Tuje Chen Magudrowe Didridugnel Kun Maludata Daglamin Padang Gagi Deje Shen La Tangwa Yidro Kunde Dang Dempa Jin Hilo Dena Jesun Lama Tuje Chen Magudrowe Digdridung Elkun Maluta Data Daglamin Pa Dang Dagi Deje Shen La Tang Wai Trokunde Dang Dempa Jingi Lo Trokunde Pajin Gilo. So the brief instruction for this meditation is that without seeking any other methods, we visualize our Lama deity and so forth, the merit field on crowns of our heads or in the space in front. And we make the request from the very depths of our heart. Please bless me so that all bodily ailments of all sentient beings, however many there are, which are more important than my own illness, ripen upon me. I'm thinking here too, Stephen mentioned that one of your members, Rowena, is in a hospice at the moment. So this is obviously a very pertinent meditation to be doing. After that, visualize the rays of light radiating out from our nostrils and striking sentient beings, whereby you inhale all their sufferings, all their illnesses without exception, such as their ailments and so forth. Through your nostrils in the aspect of black light, which absorbs into our heart, whereupon our self-cherishing is utterly vanquished. Then visualize that all happiness, pleasure, and so forth, radiating out through our nostrils in the aspect of white light, is given to all sentient beings. And here, if we're doing this in relation to one person, we visualize that we give them perfect bodies in all their future incarnations up to full enlightenment, always protected, wonderful, supportive, healthy bodies, every blessing of speech, every blessing of mind. So we'll complete the meditation there, but as the text reinforces over and over again, this is the very essence of the text. So if the only thing that comes out of doing these classes together is to cajole us or coax us into doing this practice, not just when we're doing sessions, so-called, but in the very course of our everyday life. So I think, an example of this is where in Australia, we have trams, can you believe it, that run along the middle of the roads on rails as public transport. So it's said that we can practice a complete cycle of this Tonglen meditation for someone with an ailment, for example, in the very moment of them alighting from the tram, in the amount of time it takes to take one step off the tram and reach the ground beneath, which is only seconds. If we're trained in this practice, we can do a complete round of Tonglen meditation. So this is extraordinary to contemplate the power of this practice. So moving on, last week I mentioned that the text is called the Mahayana Mind Training Wheel of Sharp Weapons that strikes the enemy's vital point. So as discussed last week, this title employs an analogy. For example, when a country is invaded, it needs weapons to fight against enemies. As this is a mind training text for bodhisattvas, the enemy here refers to self-cherishing. The bodhisattva has to eliminate self-cherishing. In order to do so, they require a supreme weapon, and that weapon is mind training. So because self-cherishing would place one's benefit above others and would thus hinder us from doing a bodhisattva's work to benefit other sentient beings, any weapon that can oppose that mind is supreme because it will destroy that attitude. So the question now comes, is this a beginner's practice? So the bodhisattva in this context is one, and this is a technical point, which I needed to clarify from last week, is one who is yet to generate bodhicitta spontaneously. I.e., they are an aspiring or trainee bodhisattva and thus have not yet stepped formally on the path of accumulation of the bodhisattva's training, though they are sincerely aspiring and preparing to do so. So I just want to cover a few very, very technical points here because they're actually of great importance and also of great interest. And I'm utilizing a conversation I had with the Venerable Galton Lecton Davis, who's one of the IMI monks in Sarah J, who's training to be a Geshe. So it's always very stimulating to run my questions past him. He said very categorically that the self-cherishing mind, and the emphasis here is on mind, is an affliction and it is an obstruction to liberation. This does not mean it exists in the mind of a Hinayana Arhat. A Hinayana Arhat, such as a solitary realizer, for example, or a hero, may still have the imprint of self-cherishing mind, but they won't have the actual mind of self-cherishing. This is impossible. Why? This is because for any Arhat to have an obstruction that is also a mind, since they have abandoned, we're talking about the Hinayana Arhat here, all obstructions to liberation, which means they have abandoned all afflictions, and any obstruction that is a mind is necessarily one of those, i.e. an affliction. When we say that they have not then eliminated the self-centered mind, we have to give it a very particular inflection, a very particular meaning, because we're no longer discussing self-cherishing as an afflicted mind. So this is why in some of the commentaries to the text, we see a reference to self-cherishing is not an afflicted mind. In this context, it's not an afflicted mind for a very important reason. It is a path. It is a lum. It's a path because the being who's practicing has chosen that journey to reach their goal of individual liberation. And to call that self-cherishing in a derogatory sense, or somehow they've failed to be a proper practitioner or they're an impure practitioner, is actually incredibly misleading and even erroneous, because it denies the validity of the Buddha's presentation of the hearers and solitary realizers' path as presented so poignantly, as we know, in the Four Noble Truths, so that those practitioners have actualized the meaning of the Four Noble Truths. However, so from their perspective, their self-cherishing that they have upon becoming an Arhat isn't an object to be abandoned and isn't an obstruction. However, from the perspective of the Bodhisattva grounds, it is an obstruction and it is to be abandoned. So you can see here how very carefully we have to tilt this topic in order not to make a mistake. So that Arhat, upon having generated great compassion, which itself is a prelude to generating bodhicitta, is then able to abandon self-cherishing, the self-cherishing they have. But again, and I quote my friend, "It is not technically an obstacle to be abandoned. It is not something to be it is something to be abandoned in relation to the Bodhisattva path. It is not a mind of self-cherishing." So we're able to say then that Bodhisattvas do not have a mind of self-cherishing, but they do have self-cherishing. This path by its very nature precludes their training as a Bodhisattva. That's the crunch from a Mahayana perspective. However, this is a detailed topic, and there are apparently some quite important debates go on in the monasteries over the interpretation of these points. And we'll hear many lamas, including Geshis, say that solitary realizers and hearers have self-cherishing minds. But my friend said that that's technically a mistake. So some Geshis say that's a mistake, other Geshis say it's not a mistake. So there's a lot of interpretation goes on here. But Geshe Doga, my teacher here in Melbourne, when asked this question, said that we can, however, talk about self-cherishing in the case of a hero or solitary realizer. With this following example, they experience a kind of sense of accomplishment and pleasure upon obtaining their goal. That is their self-cherishing. So it's very, very interesting, isn't it? So regarding bodhisattvas, the afflicted mind of self-cherishing cannot be present in the continuum of a bodhisattva on the path from accumulation upwards. This is because they can generate the mind of bodhicitta spontaneously. And because the mind of bodhicitta is the direct antidote to self-cherishing, it's impossible for both those minds to exist simultaneously in their continuum. So one final point, a bodhisattva on the path who's completed the 7th bodhisattva ground, therefore they're ready to, we're moving on to the 8th bodhisattva ground, no longer has afflicted minds. So in that regard, they're equivalent to the Hinayana Arhat. However, they still have the imprint of self-cherishing on their mind. And this imprint, in their case, functions as an obscuration to omniscience. It hinders their ability to become enlightened and therefore has to be overcome, along with the other obscurations to omniscience. So this means, to boil it all down and to answer all the questions that might have come up, only Buddhas have neither self-cherishing nor its imprints in their mental continuum. So that's the technical answer to that point. So in some of our prayers, some of us will be familiar, we make a prayer, may we not fall into, not fall into solitary peace. And within the Lam Rim presentation, we're actually told to fear solitary peace after we've overcome our fear of the lower realms and fear of samsara. So this is very interesting, isn't it? Because it means that the reason, why do we fear this particular mind from a bodhisattva's point of view, is because if we were to step onto that path, we would effectively leave behind suffering sentient beings, at least for an unimaginable length of time. In other words, to do so would be an appalling dereliction of great love and great compassion. So no matter how seductive a rapid escape from samsaric suffering might appear to be, the bodhisattva is wary of even putting their little toe onto that path. It is personally renounced, so it's a form of renunciation, because those practitioners recognize it constitutes an abandonment of the very primacy of their bodhisattva motivation. So we're turning now to the text and to the homage. To discuss the text, we need to do it at some point. To the great wrathful one Yamantaka, I pay homage. Geshe Nawandagi explains that this homage is to the great wrathful one who opposes the two negative attitudes, those of self-grasping and self-cherishing. So the question here is what is meant by the great wrathful one? In fact, what is meant by wrath here? So we need to understand wrath in a very particular way in order not to accuse it with the ordinary root delusion, anger. In general terms, wrath is classified as one of the secondary unwholesome mental factors. It's regarded as a form of anger that is ripened, intensified to the degree that one is impelled to actually strike or harm its object. So it is more than mere anger, in that it involves and impels the precipitation of an actual pathway to action. To better indicate this evolved sense, some dictionaries, Tibetan dictionaries or Buddhist terminology dictionaries, refer to it as not just being angry, but being fiercely angry. It is anger that can no longer be contained. So this is why Geshe Rabton, in his book on mind and mental factors, describes wrath under the heading of an affliction derived from anger. And these include vengeance, spite, envy, and cruelty. And his formal definition is, wrath is a mental factor that, due to the increase of anger, is a thoroughly malicious state of mind wishing to cause immediate harm. It has the function of directly connecting the person who intends to harm with the actual means to do so. So the lamas at this point always or mostly give illustrations, and one of the most famous and recurring is that of a mother's wrath towards her child who's about to stick their hand. We have things called radiators here in Australia. You know, those electric heaters. It's very, very dangerous to touch the bar because you'll be electrocuted basically, and it'll be all over in a split second. So when a mother sees her child approaching that heater, she doesn't say, darling, don't do that, please, sweetie, because that is not going to be effective. She can shout or even yank that child out of harm's way physically with such force that she dislocates the child's shoulder. This is, you know, a very vivid example, but her purpose in doing so is not to harm the child, but to rescue them from, in this case, electrocution or death. So we can understand from this that bodhisattvas are wrathful in this context because they seek to rescue sentient beings from the attitude of self-cherishing and self-concern, because they can see with immediacy the incredible harm that that's going to bring about. Thus, any bodhisattva on one of the bodhisattva grounds, from this perspective, can be called a wrathful one. But Yamantaka is the great wrathful one because he is the butcher of the Lord of Death. So Geshe Jumpa Gatso says, quote, if Yamantaka is to be wrathful at anything, he would be wrathful at self-cherishing that is in the continua of all sentient beings. Therefore, all bodhisattvas can be posited as being wrathful in this sense, because they're viewing self-cherishing as the enemy. In viewing self-cherishing as the enemy, they are not simply asserted to be wrathful. They are greatly wrathful because only compassion is involved. So with that in mind, we then move on to the purpose of a prostration. When a prostration is made to a deity, it's normally placed in order to ensure the success of the completion of the teaching. So it's a form of sort of auspiciousness to protect the teaching's reception, but also in the case of the author, to ensure that the text is completed and fulfills its designated purpose. But in a tantric context, it's also a tribute to the deity whose practice is involved or being discussed. So in our case, obviously the prostration is doubling up. It's useful here to consider the word for prostration in Tibetan, which is chagsel. So chug is an honorific term in Tibetan for hand, but in general it can mean to purify or wipe away all the conceptions, from the thought of mistakes to the virtuous friend up to the subtle dual view. So chug is like clearing the garbage away. Sell, which is a verb, means I wish. Therefore, we put chug sell together, we have the meaning I wish to clean all the wrong conceptions away. So sell does not mean showing veneration or respect by bowing in some sort of subservient sense at all. It's a much more powerful gesture than merely paying obeisance to someone more powerful than ourselves, because we're actually referring to our own intention of clearing away the obstructions and wrong conceptions within us. So another meaning of chagsel is wishing to experience non-dual exalted wisdom. This is a reference for those who are doing tantric practices to realizing wisdom, realizing bliss and emptiness in the form of one entity. And Yamantaka is of this continuum. So there's also it's necessary here perhaps to refer to the peaceful form of Yamantaka, which is orange manjushri. And we then have the wrathful form. Those two forms are not discontinuous, they're the same entity. And within some of the practices, we actually visualize the peaceful form in the heart of the wrathful form, etc., etc. So it's very important here, not to think that all the deities are somehow out there representing different things. So The meaning of Yamantaka, Yama means death and Taka means terminator or annihilator. Therefore, we can see Yamantaka as the personification of death, which can symbolize in general terms all forces opposed to the Dharma and its practice. And this is particularly poignant for those of us who are wishing to do retreat, because it's often recommended by our gurus that we do the Yamantaka retreat before moving on to the retreat of our other deities. I just mentioned this in passing, but it's actually a very important reflection, because it implies that unless we've removed basic obstructions to our practice, we're not going to be in a position to do deeper and more subtle forms of meditation. And so this is also the case in the monasteries. The Yamantaka practice is prioritized in the large Gompa pujas as a means of setting aside the obstacles, not just facing a monastery or individuals, but the world, such as COVID, for example. So the role of Yamantaka, in other words, is to perform as the antidote to death and suffering, which arise due to ignorance. And the emphasis here is on ignorance, because this ignorance is the root of all our sufferings and must be opposed with the wisdom realizing emptiness. So ignorance, in other words, is the main demon. There's a lot of talk of demons in this text, and we'll notice that the demon label is shifted around according to the context. So we don't want to get too caught up in trying to generalize, but to look at the particulars in a given moment. There are many demons, in other words, but ignorance is the main demon because it gives rise to all the afflictions. Due to the afflictions, we create contaminated actions, which bring the result of contaminated appropriated aggregates or a contaminated appropriated body. Due to possessing such a body, we also die without choice by the force of actions and afflictions. When death comes, we can't do anything about it. We can have operations, make prayers and so forth. Still, we will die. The main cause of this is the afflictions and the contaminated actions that they motivate. These are what take our life. So this is why we also talk of the afflictions as a Mara. And we have other presentations where the other Maras, 4 Maras are mentioned, the Mara of death, the Mara of the aggregates, and the Mara that is the son of the gods. Now, it's also necessary to talk about Yamantaka having 2 different senses. The first is the definitive sense, and this is the case with all our tantric deities. There's a definitive sense in which the deity, in this case Yamantaka, can be seen as the manifestation, not so much the manifestation, but the as exalted wisdom, the inseparability of method and wisdom of all the Buddhas. Then we have an interpretive sense of Yamantaka, wherein this wisdom of the non-duality of bliss and voidness is cast, as does a potter, in the perceivable form, in this case, of a wrathful deity, as represented in paintings and statues. We can also talk of outer, inner, and secret yamas. So the outer yama refers to the external lord of death, who lives in an iron palace 7 stages below the earth in the direction of the south. We'll see this reference in some of our practices, where he's constantly watching for opportunities to destroy living beings. However, we must be careful here in sort of over-objectifying the externality of the outer yama, because if we go into it in more depth, he really represents the karmic appearance that arises due to our own karma and afflictions at the time of death. So we can make these same points about the hell realms and so forth. Inner yama refers to longing desire and so forth, such as the 3 mental poisons, because it's these 3 that cause us to accumulate karma through our actions. So the main cause of death is the inner yama, our inner afflictions. Secret yama refers to the dualistic perception of the 3 types of awareness. And I'm wondering here, I'm just wondering aloud, I won't say too much, but my feeling is that the three subtle dualistic minds referred to are those of white, red, and black near attainment, which precede the mind of clear light of death, which arises at the death time. So advanced yogic bodhisattva will be able to utilize this time of the three appearances to transform the death trajectory into something else. So it becomes a very powerful purification method. So literal death, to talk of death as literally death, is not really appropriate in this context because we're talking about the ongoing process of dying or being impelled to die over and over again through the force of karma and afflictions. And this is because we haven't overcome the subtle dualistic perception, which is something that we can't achieve unless we have realized emptiness directly, non-conceptually. If we haven't done this, we're forced to continually create the causes for future samsaric rebirths according to the processes described in the 12 links of interdependent origination. From a tantric perspective, we can interrupt this process, as I mentioned, by doing practices such as taking the three kayas into the path as a means of overcoming ordinary death, intermediate state, and rebirth. And so in that context, the three yamas also have a particular significance, which I won't go into. But I would like to emphasize at this point of the presentation the incredible importance of seeing Yamantaka in this case as inseparable, utterly inseparable from our own root guru. This is because we can make two distinctions in the same way about the guru that we made in relation to Yamantaka. We can talk about the guru in their Dharmakaya aspect, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche refers to this as the ultimate guru, where the guru is the non-dual bliss and emptiness that we talked about. But we can also talk about the guru in an Emanakaya or emanation form. And this is referring to the relative guru. And this is the guru with whom we can have lunch next Wednesday if we're very lucky. I just remember on this point that Geshe Nawandagi, who's one of my teachers as well, said to me one day when I was in a queue waiting to make an offering and receive a blessing, he just looked at me with this incredible penetrating stare that he had, which could be withering, by the way, if you weren't doing the right thing. And he said to me, the most important guru is the one who lives with you every day. And I remember being taken back by that. It was such a very extraordinary statement, and I continue to reflect on it. But I think he means this, the same point that we're making here. And it's rather curious because we have this phenomena here with Tara Institute. As soon as a so-called illustrious High Lama is advertised as coming to town, many students go rushing off to attend those special teachings. Do you have this happening in America? I'm sure you don't, because you're more advanced practitioners, I'm sure. But and meanwhile, our local teacher who has sacrificed 3 or 4 decades of living in a monastery and so forth, surrounded by their Tibetan friends and Sangha, is left with a half-empty gompa. So this is completely back to front, if we look at it from this perspective, because we're not recognizing that the relative guru is in fact the kindest of all, because as Pabonka says so clearly in Liberation, it's only that one who somehow has the method to manifest in a form sufficiently, and I'm using this in inverted commas, crude, to have a rapport or a resonance with our current level of deluded mind. So that is the most precious. So I just, Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, therefore, The Guru's kindness cannot fit in the sky. We're guided by the Guru from beginningless life. All our happiness comes from the Guru. Every single present and future happiness until we achieve enlightenment comes from the Guru. As the great yogi Buddhayana said, before what is called Guru, there is not even the name Buddha. All the Buddhas are manifestations of the Guru. So if we don't relate this quotation to the absolute Guru, it doesn't make sense. And neither will many of the prayers we find in the Guru Puja. In other words, the Buddha doesn't exist before the Guru. All the Buddhas, as well as the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, come from the Guru. So this is a very important topic or point to internalize when we're considering the prostration in this text. So when we prostrate to Yamantaka, in other words, we're respectively bowing at the feet of our own peerless Guru, the Lord of which pervades everywhere. And so to quote verse 53 from Lama Chopa, you are our gurus, you are our yidams, you are our dakinis and dharma protectors. From this moment until our enlightenment, we seek no refuge other than you. In this life, the bardo, and in all future lives. Hold us with your hook of compassion, free us from samsara and nirvana's fears, note nirvana's fears, grant all attainments, be our unfailing friend and guard us from interferences. So this returns us to the very initial quote from Lama Zopa Rinpoche, which is that we are to consider even negative experiences as manifestations of the Guru. Rinpoche said, every single present and future happiness until we achieve enlightenment comes from the Guru, but we must also regard that every single unpleasant experience also comes from the Guru, because not only does it give us a chance to purify our negative karma, which has been accrued and will ripen often disastrously in the future, but it gives us the quintessential pivotal moment to perform thought transformation. And for this reason is the most precious moment of all. So this is a good point now to step onto verses 1 and 2. I'm going to ask John to put them up on our screen.
Is that the blue one?
Yeah, so the one with the coloured background. Thanks, John.
Yeah.
The decorated one.
Yeah. Hold on, I'll just...
And if we scroll to verses 1 and 2, or 1 if we can't fit them both on the screen.
Yeah, I can make that a bit smaller.
There we go. Lovely. Thank you. Just as when peacocks wander in the jungles of lethal poison, although they're extremely beautiful medicinal gardens, the flocks of peacocks do not delight in them, but instead are nourished by the essence of the lethal poison. So the point here is that according to the kind of animal law surrounding the peacock isn't attracted to beautiful flowers or berries. It always looks out for the poisonous plants. This is because by eating the poisonous plants, they enjoy a diet which nourishes their body and also brings luster and more splendor to their plumage. The second verse, if we can just scroll down to it briefly, extends this analogy to the brave Bodhisattva. And this is clear from the use of the word similarly, meaning in similar fashion. Here, the Bodhisattvas are called heroes or brave ones because they have totally forsaken their selfish pursuits with the cultivation of an altruistic mind with altruistic intentions. So these practitioners enter deliberately the jungle of psychic existence, the forest of worldly concerns, in order to benefit others. And so they thrive in this environment, which for a less exalted being would be a deadly place to be. So in other words, even if bodhisattvas choose to enter the realm of worldly pleasures and so forth, they're never actually attracted to them. They're never attracted to any apparent pleasure, happiness, glory, or marvelous thing that we can see in this existence. This is because the bodhisattvas foresee or predict that the consequences of being attracted to seeming pleasures and beauty will lead only to suffering and misery. So here it's necessary to at least reflect briefly on the meaning of the three types of suffering, or any of the sets of sufferings, if you like. And we find these in the Lam Rim presentation. And obviously the suffering of suffering doesn't need much discussion because it's palpable. And it said that even dogs know this one all too well. If they're injured, they will cry out in pain. But it's much harder to penetrate the meaning or detect the presence of the suffering of change. And the lamas often give the illustration here of waiting for your Christmas holidays, your annual leave, and you go to the beach. And all your wishes are fulfilled, apparently. But then you come down with a massive case of sunburn, and you get bitten by march flies, and you get food poisoning at the local hotel. And then you decide, and your partner meets someone gorgeous in the cafeteria when you're not there, and decides to go and live with them in another country, etc., etc. And before you know where you are, you're living a sheer hell. How many of us have had a holiday that's turned into hell after 2 or 3 days? Especially if it's in Bali. I had a friend who just went to Thailand, and over a 6-week period came down with COVID and then couldn't get back to Australia. So his paradisical holiday in Thailand was an absolute torment from beginning to end. But the third type of suffering is the one that we really need to pay attention to here, and that's pervasive suffering, or as Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, all pervasive suffering. And it refers to our aggregates, which are under the control of the afflictions. Our suffering is compounded in the sense that our aggregates are already contaminated by the seeds of the disturbing thoughts, and we carry the imprints of disturbing thoughts on our continuum, and therefore will definitely meet with desirable and undesirable, ugly and beautiful objects in the future. It is also compounding in a second sense, because if we haven't generated the true path where these conditions and objects are when these conditions and objects are encountered, they'll cause further disturbing thoughts of anger, desire, and ignorance to arise. So the original mistake in this scenario is not having generated the remedy of the path. Nor do we apply meditation to these objects, and hence didn't oppose delusion arising and motivating more karma, which in turn leads to more imprints on the mind to produce future samsara, where more karmic seeds are produced. So Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, sometimes I notice that the translation for the Tibetan term for pervasive compounding suffering leaves out the pervasive bit. This means one doesn't get the idea of how suffering is compounding in that it creates the future samsaric suffering. The conclusion is that these aggregates compound the future life samsara and are pervasive because under the control of karma and delusion. Many people think, what is the point of practicing religion? And that the only ones needing to practice Buddhism are those who are suffering. This implies that those people don't feel they have any problems. But such a belief indicates that they don't understand what it means to suffer, what suffering means, and nor suffering's extent, nor its different levels. So in other words, to contemplate the meaning of all compounded or pervasive suffering is to touch on the very meaning of samsara, kowa, returning to sort of this idea of returning, beginningless returning cycle of death and rebirth under the control of delusion and karma. It's fraught with suffering, and it's accompanied by the contaminated aggregates. So Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, pervasive compounding suffering we have been discovering is itself the meaning of samsara. Samsara refers to the way in which the defilements defiled by the contaminated seeds and disturbing thoughts are received by the receiver or carrier. So we're like someone carrying our own corpse of deluded aggregates on our back. This image is given in the text. And we're laboring under this incredible burden, even when we're playing in the garden of pleasure in the Bali holiday resort, Club Med, or whatever it might be. So although the second verse says, although there are beautiful gardens of splendid happiness, the heroes do not become attached to them. This is because they recognize the shortcomings of the lower realms, but they also recognize the shortcomings of the upper realms, right up to the tip of cyclic existence. In other words, they have perfect renunciation, even wishing to forgo, renounce the outcome of personal liberation in their brave bid to be the best able to remain behind in this jungle of suffering and pain to benefit all suffering mothers. This is the essential point being made in these verses. Rather than seeking to escape suffering, the Bodhisattva heads right in. Because with skill and knowledge, they're able to turn adverse situations into a means to achieve enlightenment for themselves. But this isn't their primary aim. Their primary aim is to optimize their power and ability to benefit those who are suffering and to care for them in the most responsible way. So it's interesting that Geshe Jumper Geltsen, in his commentary at this point, takes a little side journey into the possibility of having bad and good friends, samsaric friends, and he sort of expands it quite a bit. But he's, we all know of someone who's gone off with an alcoholic friend for a holiday and has come back alcoholic, or a more serious example would be as a junkie, wouldn't it? They develop a habit while holidaying and can't throw the habit. So what happens if we start to think about internal friend and enemy? And so it's really necessary here to take it away from the external friend and enemy and think about who is our internal friend. That's our aspiring bodhisattva self. And our internal enemy is the samsaric being ensconced in the thicket of samsaric pleasures. And so much so that they can't even put their head up to look around to see what's happening. So we need to make discretional decisions about which impulses internally we follow to really begin to practice. Because unless we do this, we haven't got an opportunity of utilizing or even hoping to utilize the impediments that we find in our environment. True heroes wander in the forest of worldly existence. They're not attracted to many, they're not attracted by many alluring things because they see the disadvantages. And because of this, they are free to utilize the impediments of those environments as conditions conducive to the development of bodhicitta. So because of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but normally it would be very good here to do an exposition of the 8 worldly dharmas. Because unless we recognize the operation of the 8 worldly dharmas in our own life, we're not going to see exactly how perniciously ensconced we are in the jungle of cyclic existence, or how we're not at all not immune to the beautiful gardens of splendid happiness, nor their opposites. In fact, we're always constantly ricocheting from one to the other. So in a friendly letter, Nagarjuna writes, "O you who are wise in the affairs of this perishable world, the 8 perishably based phenomena are receiving and not receiving, being well and being unwell, hearing and not hearing," and here it's pleasant words, being praised and being abused, and never let these 8 be an object of our mind's concern, have a level head and an even temperament. So these 8 worldly concerns keep us very, very, very busy in our lives, and we're trapped by them. And in her presentation on this topic, the Venerable Thupten Chodron refers to Lama Yeshe, and it's lovely to quote Lama Yeshe on this point, who says we've got yo-yo minds. We're sometimes up and we're sometimes down. Someone says we're wonderful and we feel up. Someone says you've made a mistake and you feel down. Someone gives us a present, we feel good. Then we lose our present and we feel bad. This constant yo-yo mind is dependent on external objects and people and leaves us oblivious, and this is the crunch, to how our mind is the actual source of our happiness and misery. So I won't go into that more, but Lama Yeshe does raise the interesting point that perhaps, and quote, "at least in wealthy countries, we wind up disappointed and frustrated because we think all of this will bring us genuine happiness, and it doesn't. It brings its own set of problems." And this is something that the lamas notice when they come to the West. And I know from my own experience, my teachers, when they've come from Sera Monastery, not just to the West, but to Melbourne, and not just to Melbourne, but to Chadstone, which is probably one of those gargantuan shopping malls you do so well in America, that are almost like empires unto themselves. They have their own interior gardens and artificial light and even stars in their foyers that twinkle. And I was in one of these malls with Geshe Doga, who was shopping for a leather shoulder bag, only to carry his text in, by the way. And he said, as an aside, how unhappy all these people are. And I looked around and thought, crikey, look, he's right. They're all unhappy, aren't they? They're all miserable. I even noticed this often coming back from India, how miserable people look in the West. They're all sort of contained in their own little bubbles, and they're all looking kind of tense. They might crack a smile once in a while, but it's not very genuine or very deep. And I think there's a kind of almost a false promise that we're given in this culture, that we're going to be happy if you do all the right things as a consumer. But when it doesn't deliver, we flip into depression, alienation, and misery. So these are really pernicious. So to really exemplify this topic of the avoiding the 8 worldly dharmas, I'm just going to quote a very beautiful story, true story, from the life of Geshe Langri Tangpa, who's one of the founding lineage holders of this particular lojong tradition. Once, when the mendicant monk Langri Tempa, another mentor of advice, was delivering a discourse to thousands of disciples, a sickly child was born nearby. An astrologer told the mother that to save the infant's life, she must take it to a high spiritual master and claim it to be his child. Obediently, the mother brought the baby to Langri Tangpa in the middle of his teachings and declared before everyone present that it was his. This was an ordained monk, by the way. He happily accepted the child and said, "For all of my lives, you have been my child." Half the disciples lost their faith and immediately walked away. They thought it was his child from this life. The rest of the audience stayed. At the end of the discourse, the mother presented the master with offerings and apologized by explaining the situation, at which point Langri Tangpa simply gave the child back. Throughout the entire scene, he maintained complete equanimity, and for the half of the disciples who stayed, their faith remained unaffected or grew even stronger. So Geshe Nawandagi, who accounts this wonderful story in Well-Spoken Advice, says, but we could not bear such an occurrence if it happened to us. We would make a big scene trying to prove ourselves innocent. To Langri Tangpa, it made no difference. He knew he had done no wrong. Thus, if we maintain purity within, we do not have to impress others that we are holy by external displays of false piety or by never associating with ordinary people. So I think this is really, really worth considering. So this second verse, referring to the way in which the Bodhisattva happily enters samsara, is also connected to a joy. And this joy arises because they're not affected by the delusions in their mind, just as in the case of Geshe Langri Tangpa. So if we apply this to our own situation, if we can remove our delusions, we'll be able to unfold the happiness we already have. We can see that everything around us is a cause to enhance peace and happiness in the mind. So this is really giving us an incredible clue to the almost alchemical power that this Bodhisattva has to transform what are apparently adverse conditions in the poisonous garden into beautiful conditions, lustrous conditions, as does the peacock. So we're going to move now to verse 3. Thank you, John. Because of that, those who are under the power of the cowardice that eagerly pursues happiness and pleasure spend their time in suffering, while the brave-minded ones who willingly accept suffering are always happy due to the strength of their courage. So those who fall for the samsaric pleasures and eagerly pursue them are called cowards precisely because they compulsively spend their time immersed in suffering. So the reference in this verse, because of that, so there's a corollary here, a logical corollary, is referring to none other than us. We are those who fall under the power of the cowardice that eagerly pursues happiness and pleasure, and thus spend our time in suffering. So the moral of this verse, really, the thing we should take from it, is that we should voluntarily accept suffering, because by doing the opposite, fighting and suffering and not seeking to go beyond its causes in some sort of deeper sense, we've been suffering continuously and have met with nothing but suffering in the past. So therefore, if now, the emphasis is on now, if now we don't turn upon that, we'll simply create more suffering into the indefinite future. Being cowards, we have not cherished others and have run towards suffering in pursuit of pleasure. We cannot embrace suffering now, and we shall not see its end. So there's a real juxtaposition here between the mode of a bodhisattva and the mode of the ordinary worldly being. And so the other takeout for this verse is that we should practice tolerance and not lose our own courage or spirit. It indicates, in other words, this verse indicates that happiness cannot arise merely by wishing for it, even if we spend our whole life pursuing those goals. We must create the causes to experience the happiness we seek, and we must create the causes for those suffering sentient beings to achieve the happiness they seek. Therefore, it is due to cowardice that persons avidly pursue their own happiness and so come to suffer. So as Lama Yeshe was saying with the yo-yo analogy, where if we wonder whether we're one of these us that we're referring to in this verse, consider if we're emotionally stable. If we're emotionally unstable, is anyone of us emotionally unstable, by the way? If we're emotionally unstable and find ourselves vulnerable to external influences, then we will experience some sort of joy if we make some small profit or victory, but we'll quickly lose it and become discouraged and disappointed. So Shantideva says in that very famous verse, we're exactly like this. Although wishing to be rid of misery, they run towards misery itself. Though wishing to have happiness like an enemy, they ignorantly destroy it. So the great irony here, as mentioned at the end of the second verse and the end of the third verse, is that the Bodhisattva, though not seeking joy, finds it. This is because the heroic attitude creates merit and incredibly powerful purification, which will eventually result in the attainment of enlightenment. So just to give a very powerful example of a bodhisattva's action in the poisonous garden, Dharmarakshita, the author of this text, encountered many personal hardships. And so Geshe Sopa tells this story in his commentary. He says, he once met a poor dying man who had been advised by a doctor to consume human flesh to get better. Dharmarakshita heard this and immediately went to the man, cut off the flesh from his thigh, and offered it to rescue that man. Dharmarakshita experienced great pain on account of this act, and it took a long time for the wound to heal, which was due to his own past negative karma. Many people tried to help him cure his wound, but he was unfazed, saying that he was willing to die from the wound because what he did was meaningful. That night, before going to bed, Dharmarakshita generated a strong aspiration to be the cause to free all beings from suffering. During sleep, he had a dream that the Buddha applied a patch onto his wound, and when Dharmarakshita woke up, he was completely healed. So, of course, apart from the physical miraculous dimensions of this story, we have to say that, yes, Dharmarakshita was completely healed because he had the aspiration to free all beings from suffering. This was the real remedy in that moment. So I'll ask John to give us verses 4 and 5. Presently, attachment is like a jungle of lethal poison. It is overcome by the peacock-like heroes, but it takes the life of crow-like cowards. How can the selfish overcome this poison? If they are also similarly involved in the other afflictions, these afflictions will cost the crow-like their life. So desire here is likened to a poisonous plant. And if we don't contemplate the nature of desire, then we'll fail to find any fault in it. So we must look here at our own unwittingly compulsive behaviour. And I wanted to, just to give a quick story here of my own. I sent John an image of yabbies, but I don't know if you've got it, John. Did you find it? It was an email attachment I sent. about half an hour before the teaching started. Ah, there we go. So yabbies are like little freshwater crayfish. When my mother was dying in hospital, she was on life support, and my parents had retired to Yarrawonga, a country town on the Murray River between New South Wales and Victoria. So it was sort of relatively isolated. And in order to help my mother, it was very difficult, because she was on life support and there were restricted hours visiting and so forth in the ICU unit. We're familiar with these sorts of situations. I drew upon my sort of sense of practice and realized that I was in a famous Yarrawonga fishing town. Fishing tackle was everywhere in the town. And in the fishing tackle shops, there were kids swimming pools, plastic pools inside the shop full of yabbies that were to be bought by the fisher people to be put on their hooks and used as bait. So they were destined, in other words, for a rather grim end. So I bought a large bucket of yabbies and requested my father's help here. And this was actually a very moving part of the story, because I'd never known to what extent my father thought my interest in Buddhism was wacky or not. I do know when he visited Geshe Doga on one occasion, we were coming out, I said, "Oh, Geshe Doga's always happy, Dad." And my father said, "Bloody well ought to be. He doesn't have to work, does he?" Terrible, isn't it? So he had that very matter-of-fact approach, but he took this very seriously because it was for his dear wife. And so together we released the yabbies in a pond, a swamp, where yabbies like swamps at the edge of the Murray River. And the experience was very, very profound, because some of the yabbies, as soon as they got a taste of the outer water, lifted their feelers, flicked their tails, and were out of there. They were gone from the bucket in the flash of light. Other yabbies were kind of slow to work out what to do, and they kind of almost cumbersomely clambered towards the opening and then fell laboriously over the edge of the bucket into the lagoon. And other yabbies, and these are the ones that I'm interested in, particularly from this story point of view, rather perversely kept pushing desperately at the bottom of the sideways turned bucket, trying to escape, not realizing that freedom was already presented to them palpably immediately behind. They didn't have the nous, in other words, to turn around. And so this is the crunch. If for as long as we don't have the nous to turn around, we'll be unable to perform the Bodhisattva's deeds in the garden. So we'll be unable, like the peacock, like the Bodhisattva hero, to master the conditions of samsara, but like the coward, like the crow, we will perish. So only the truly brave can utilize desire in the path. For them, it's not an obstruction, but it's a means to obtain their ultimate goal. Crows, it seems, get bad press. But the point of this example of the crow in this moment of the text is that if the crow, like us, eats poisonous berries, it dies. Whereas if the peacock eats poisonous berries, it flourishes and becomes like the Bodhisattva, more radiant. So it's really important here to blame not the object of desire, but the mind of desire. And it's valuable, and I'll just sort of touch on this briefly, but it's really a critical account. We can beat ourselves up and say, look, it's really great Ross is saying we shouldn't be like crows, we should be like peacocks, but it's damn hard, isn't it, to give up desires and not to be affected by non-desires, like afflictions, painful situations, with the same force. We're trapped. So we beat ourselves up and think we're a failed practitioner. But Buddhism is very careful on this point to give a very specific account about how the afflictions arise. And so the classic presentation is that through ignorance, we superimpose an intrinsic findability onto this I, this merely labeled I, which we then grasp at as existing in that way. So that's the first foundational moment of the rising of a mind of affliction. This grasping takes the form of an identification of that conceived I, which has been superimposed, that's the one that appears to be inherently existent, and the real I, inverted commas, which is the merely conventional I. In fact, the point is that this ignorance can't distinguish between the I that does validly exist and the I that has been superimposed and is grasped at as the real I. And upon this basis, we discriminate between an inherently existent I and an inherently existent other. This is really, really profound, because we're setting up a kind of dialectic here, which is going to embrace our whole perception of reality from a deluded perspective. So not only do I have a problem with clinging to grasping a deluded I as inherently existent, but I grasp at an inherently existent non-I as inherently existent. So we then generate attachment for this I. So you can see here that attachment's coming quite late in the process, relatively, and a craving for the happiness of this I arises. Since the self's happiness cannot arise without dependence on one's property, resources in other words, craving for that property, mine, arises. So see here, the ripples are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. This would include our possessions and including our body. And so due to this, we become obscured by faults, seeing the exaggerated quality in things. Seeing pleasant things, we desire them. Seeing unpleasant things, we spurn them. We see things as mine, we cling to them. Things that aren't mine, we forcibly push away. And in this way, the afflictions thus produce, such as anger, craving, desire, jealousy, pride, and so forth, conceptually motivate actions. And from these actions leaving their imprints on our consciousness, we create the conditions for the life cycle of samsara to be constantly held together. So the critical point here, from this point of this topic, is that when we get to the point of beginning to embellish what has been grasped at as inherently existent as the real object, we then have this capacity to project other qualities onto that. So if we take an example of mine isn't just a book that is mine. Mine, Jeffrey Hopkins says in a rather interesting way, he says it shouldn't be called mine because that's sort of an object. It should be called a mining, a making mine. The real affliction here is a making mineness, which will stake everything in holding that relationship with me inseparably. And this is very, very painful to sever. And so this embellishment, this decoration of the object after the initial grasping at it as being inherently existent is called inappropriate attention. And this is the problem, apart from the fundamental problem of grasping at inherently existent things. Because that embellishment is hallucinated. It is not an actual feature of the object. Amazingly powerful, this contemplation. Instinctively, we feel that it's there with the object from its own side, addressing us with its identity, which we then relate to from where we are, which is also from where it is with its own identity. And so we're kind of creating this hyper hallucinatory dichotomy between self and other, which is entirely fabricated by the hallucinating dualistic mind. So in order to begin to intrude on desire, there are different techniques, of course, but one of them is to catch the mind. We haven't got much chance of catching the mind at the first moment because we've got innate self-grasping. Innate means that it's unconscious. It doesn't have to be fabricated mentally on the spot through some deliberate conscious activity. It will automatically be there. Some technical debates about that, but in general terms, it's already there. But at the very moment that we start to embellish it with an extra attractiveness, we should intrude and cut. And that will then stop the desire from manifesting in its fruitional or fully evolved form. It's very difficult to put out fully evolved desire. When we're holding the object of desire, we've actually obtained it. To let it go is incredibly hard. But we do have an opportunity of working at this other end of the process. So I just raise that as a really, really important contemplation. And Shanti David, of course, gives that very famous verse about, I'll quote it, "When a fire in one house is moved into another, it is right to get rid of the straw and such things that will cause the fire to spread. Likewise, when the fire of hatred spreads to whatever my mind is attached, I should immediately get rid of it for fear of my merit being burned." So the skillful thing here is that not only do we not let the fire jump from one house to the next, but we attempt to remove the straw that's sitting there waiting to be ignited. And this involves delving more and more deeply into that evolutionary process by which the afflicted minds are generated. So it's this ignorance clinging to an eye as a real eye that immerses us in a darkness, which is the tangled jungle that is being presented in this text, that prevents us from seeing the way things actually are and acting appropriately. So Chandra Kirti says in his commentary on the 400 stanzas, this summarizes: attachment and so on engage only a thing's inherent nature imputed by ignorance, based on which they superimpose particular attributes such as attractiveness and ugliness. Therefore, they do not engage differently from ignorance, and they depend on ignorance because ignorance is the principal one. So we've still got a few moments. So I'll move to the 5th verse. Thank you. Well, no, I'll read it out. We had it before, John, but it was, there we go. I won't say a lot, but how can persons concerned only by their own desires master this poison? If they involve themselves in the other afflictions as well, it will cost them their chance for emancipation, just like the crow. So the meaning of this verse is quite self-explanatory. Selfish people are likened to crows. Brave bodhisattvas, like peacocks, who relish poisonous plants, can engage completely differently because they have no self-cherishing mind, and they therefore can make use of desire in terms of helping others. In other words, they are strengthened by desire rather than harmed by it. And they can only do so, only act in this way on the basis of having already generated the minds of the small, similar to the practitioner of the small and middling scope. So for those of us who have studied the Lam Rim, we'll recognize here that this means we must already have renounced are the lower realms and samsara through doing all the contemplations that the Lam Rim presents and having actualized them. Until we have done that, we're like crows. So we need to actively engage in contemplating death and impermanence, the suffering of the lower realms, practicing refuge in the three jewels, developing faith and conviction in the law of cause and effect, contemplating general and specific samsaric sufferings, the sufferings of the higher realms in particular, the Four Noble Truths, understanding them, the 12 links of interdependent origination, and determining from that the path to liberation. So Geshe Jumpa Gyatso makes a very important distinction at this point of his commentary. He says that, yes, while we can incorporate desire into the path as a bodhisattva, it's not the case that we can necessarily import the other delusions. We can import anger, and an example of that would be the Yamantaka practice, for example. But a deluded mind such as ignorance cannot be incorporated into any being's path, because its aspect is to confound and sort of numb the awareness of the mind itself. And therefore it's totally opposed to any sort of refinement of our consciousness. So if we now refer to Tantra, Tantra definitely presents a very specific means for utilizing desire in the path. And this is presented according to the 4 levels of Tantra in different ways. So as we move through the 4 levels of Tantra, we develop more refined and powerful methods of utilizing the path. But in the case of highest yoga Tantra, and I quote here because I'm not seeking to sort of break tantric vows by talking about these things, but this point is made by Geshe Jumpa Gyatso in his commentary, and His Holiness has also made this point in large public gatherings. He says, someone who's able to melt the white and red seeds, whereby great bliss that simultaneously realizes emptiness is produced, that person is able to carry attachment into the path where others cannot. So I just leave that for contemplation and further investigation. But in general, when we're talking about this text, it falls within the common teachings of Sutra, where it presents utilizing desire as a contributory factor to gain enlightenment rather than a principal factor. So this is a really important distinction. And this idea of desire being utilized directly is a feature that's found only in Mantrayana. But if we step back from this sort of very, very subtle tantric presentation to give some examples of how a bodhisattva could use desire in the path, the commentary, one of the commentaries gives the example of a bodhisattva owning a very beautiful house, and they recognize that it's a very beautiful house, and they seek to use that house in whatever way is possible for the benefit of others. In no way do they regard that house as an object to be personally cherished and protected for their own selfish accomplishment or gain. In other words, when desire arises in a bodhisattva, they immediately see its faults and think of using whatever they possess in order to liberate all beings from suffering. Thus, bodhisattvas utilize all their possessions to fulfill the welfare of other beings. And in this way, possessions don't serve as a source of suffering from them. So again, the verses are asking us to contrast this with our own indulging. Because we indulge, according to the commentary, the nectar that produces the sprout benefiting others, by Dorje Chung Shempo Losang Yeshi Tempa Rabje Pel Sangpo, if we indulge like the crows, it will cost us the life of liberation. That is, we'll cut its life vein. I found this a really powerful statement. We cut the very jugular of the life of liberation. So the conclusion is that we're like the yabbies in the bucket, and perhaps the yabbies in the back of the bucket. So I realised I'll just go for 5 more minutes because I wanted to finish the 6th verse because it's pretty straightforward. Because of this, and John, you might like to show it for us if you can. Because of this, the peacock-like brave-minded ones combine the afflictions which are like a jungle of poison into an elixir, and they enter the jungle of cycle existence while willingly accepting them, they should destroy the poison. So the image here is an alchemical one. The alchemist could transform mercury into gold. In the same way, the Bodhisattva can transform objects of attachment and afflictions into causes for enlightenment. And an example given in a number of the commentaries on this verse is the very famous story of Atisha when he came to Tibet in 1042. He brought, the story's told slightly differently in different texts, but it amounts to the same thing. He brought a particularly unpleasant Indian teacher in order, in fact, only in order to enhance his practice of patience. He was actually challenged by his disciples saying, why did you bring this guy along? He's an absolute nightmare. And that's how Atisha replied. But he did add, and I think this is a really delightful finish to the story. Later on, Atisha did send the object of his patience back to India, but with the comment, having met the Tibetans, the Indian was no longer needed. So I'm wondering here, what would happen if you had met the Australians? And I dare not speak for the Americans. Yeah. So, so a bodhisattva will experience great joy when meeting their enemy, encountering an object, so-called enemy. For them will be encountering an object of patience. And that person will appear to them like meeting a dear friend. And I always feel, of course, that His Holiness the Dalai Lama, absolutely epitomizes this aspect of enlightened activity, because there's a joy, a sheer intimate joy arising spontaneously upon encountering each and every person or creature as he meets them. So with this, we've reached the end of the 6th verse, and according to the classical structure of the commentaries, this completes the general survey of the general stages and paths. And we now move to verses 7 to 102. Well, 7's we'll discuss next week, but to 102, which cover the practices aimed at obtaining enlightenment for the sake of others. And then verses 103 to 1116 cover the topic of ultimate bodhicitta, which involves the wisdom practices aimed at attaining enlightenment for the benefit of others. So we need to marry these two sets together. So the last verse of the text is a dedication to accomplish these goals. So with that, we've completed today's teaching, and you can see here that we're still preparing quite a lot of groundwork, but the text from now on is going to be dealing with very specific situations that we encounter. And so it has a kind of existential immediacy to it, which won't require the same kind of commentary, general commentary to do with what's the nature of samsara, what's the nature of all pervasive compounded suffering and so forth. So I hope you grant me a little bit of freedom to spend extra time on those topics. And I'm attempting to weave the topic. I'm conscious that some may, I'm not saying the ones present here, but some may feel that they've done this topic. I've done Tonlen, or I've done lojong. Don't have to talk about that now. I've done it, thanks. I did it last year, between March and April, and I'm now ready for other things. But it doesn't work that way, does it? In fact, we only begin to see that we need to practice when we constantly mull over these points. And so the vividness of these stanzas really brings this reality home, I think, over and over again. I also want to mention, particularly at Stephen's request, but also because it is really necessary, each class is accompanied by a set of questions. And those questions are attempting to draw out the content in various ways, or some of the key content of that week's discourse. And I've given you an option on tonight's homework. I'm calling them homeworks, that to select 3 of the above. So I'm not trying to create an onerous situation, but the crux of this is that at the end of the 12 weeks, the combined sets of homework will become the golden crucible from which the exam questions will be picked. So I'm not that concerned to see your answers to each and every question, but I'll be talking with Stephen more going forward about how we might best communicate what's happening. But to do the homework is very, very valuable, and for that reason. And if you are intending to sit the exam, it sounds very onerous, but it's not intended to be at all. It will then work towards you qualifying along with the other basic program subjects to be a credited FPMT teacher. And of course, there's immense benefits can flow from that. And so some of us may be intending to do that. So to keep that in mind, if you don't keep up with the homework and don't sit the exam, you won't be in that position. But you're still absolutely welcome to come and enjoy the session. So it's entirely up to you how you approach it. So we'll now dedicate. Thank you, Stephen.
Dedication prayers. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Long life prayers for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. To the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the 3 jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Tenzin Osel Hita, Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long.
And I wanted to mention before we slip away that as part of the basic program, but again, not exclusive to it, there's a half-hour discussion following the session, which Stephen very kindly offers. So please partake of that. And it is very beneficial in lots of ways, not just yourselves, but it also helps Stephen and myself get some sort of gist too, because one of the handicaps of online delivery, of course, is you don't have that immediate contact. In fact, His Holiness the Dalai Lama mentions sometimes that unless you're with the students you're teaching, you don't get the scent of virtue, the scent of morality. And I think it's a very ingenious, extremely interesting comment, isn't it? Because you kind of sense, when he says the morality is not judging, but you get to feel where people are, where they're coming from. And that's obviously a lot harder with remote learning. So I can't claim any clairvoyancy whatsoever. I'm sort of having to guess. So I'm attempting to present in a way that weaves together some quite subtle points with some of the more obvious ones in a way, organic whole that will work for everyone, hopefully. So thank you.